All right, let's get started. So, Mr. Ryan Gonsalves, welcome to the Strategy Factory. Let's kick off with a bit of an intro. Tell me about yourself.
Tom, firstly, thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Well, I am sitting here in Sydney, like many people are at this COVID period. I live in North Sydney with my wife and 3 young boys. And I've really been looking forward to catching up with you today. It's perhaps for me a good time to reflect on, I guess, some of my work experience and the strategic thinking that you and I have shared over the past few years. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Awesome. And talk me through your kind of career a little bit. So we work together, so we'll get to that a little bit later, but yeah, talk us through for the viewers.
Well, I've been in and out of financial services for probably the past 20 or so years. I've been lucky enough to work for some of the largest corporates such as GE, HSBC, and AMP here in Australia, and indeed the public sector here in Australia. But working for some of those corporates has been fantastic because I've had that opportunity to work for them in North America, in Europe, in Asia as well. So quite a global mix of experiences. And starting in a consumer finance sort of world or consumer banking perspective, from GE in cards and sort of fast finance through to HSBC, where I found myself as their global head of mortgage product based out of Hong Kong for around 10 years or so. And more recently, I found myself working in the Australian banking wealth management sector, which really gets me to this seat today.
And before all that, you had a bit of a different career, is that right?
Yes, that is right. I was definitely lucky enough to leave school at 16 in the UK and got a chance to be an apprentice and then professional football player. So that was a great start to life, achieving what was my dream, being a professional footballer, waking up, playing football, having a chip butty, and then going home. It was absolutely fantastic. So everything after that really has been it's just cream on the top for me. So I have a very enjoyable approach towards life as a result.
Yeah, totally. No, it's pretty cool. I mean, that you don't get many people that played and trained at a top level of professional football in the UK and then pivoted into such a successful financial services career. I reckon there must be a handful, if that, of people that have done that in the world.
Yeah, I think you're right. Many of the guys that I certainly played with and then latterly coached, I think many stayed within sport. They stayed really close to the field if they were lucky enough to be able to do that. Very few of us, I can probably think of 2, personally who I played with who have moved into the corporate world and really established a career for themselves in that. And so it's great to be able to do that. And probably for me, a lot of lessons I took from being in high performance sports that were able to come with me towards at least my approach towards the corporate life, to managing teams, motivating people, and really sort of getting towards that shared common goal. So football for me has been, it's remained a fantastic part, an integral part of certainly my life, professionally and personally.
Yeah, that's awesome. So for a bit of background, so Ryan and I actually met in Hong Kong. So before my Cascade life, I was in the banking world as well. So I was working at HSBC. So we met in Hong Kong, both in, I suppose, global or regional roles where we were kind of looking after things. For me, it was more on the kind of retail lending side, and for Ryan, it was more on the mortgage side. So we were looking after things for the region initially, and then globally after that for Ryan. Talk to me a little bit about that role that you did there. What was that all about?
Yeah, like you say, it started regionally, and it was fun. I think you and I certainly did have a good time, and I think the role itself was quite fascinating for me. What attracted me originally to the role at HSBC was actually the fact it was a bank, and I thought it was really fascinating to come to an organisation different to GE, which was really fast and forward thinking, to a big established bank like HSBC. And what was interesting in the role was the fact I came in at this regional level, and it was regional looking after 17 or 18 different markets. One of them didn't really want us to work with them, but it was more definitely 18 markets, and trying to establish a common strategy for how they approached lending. And you had markets from as far as New Zealand to India to South Korea and China, and trying to find out, well, what is it that could bring them together from a consumer asset or from a lending perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was, so for me, it was, one of the hardest things. There were two things that I found really hard about the role. I'd like to get your opinion on it. One was trying to come up with a strategy that can work for India and New Zealand from any kind of product perspective, just in terms of the maturity of the markets. And then the second thing that I think maybe was more personal for me is I had quite a strong sense of kind of, I think, almost imposter syndrome sometimes, because as you said, some of the countries didn't necessarily want to work with you. And there was this challenge of kind of going in and sort of trying to almost give advice, not tell them what to do, but there was certainly an element of accountability there. I personally found that really difficult because I didn't necessarily feel like I had a lot of credibility around the lending market in Brunei, for example. How did you, so first of all, how did you kind of go about coming up with a strategy that would work across those markets? And then secondly, how did you overcome that kind of lack of on the ground credibility while still adding value to them as a partner?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it was really challenging, I think. And for me, it was something that emerged rather than an intentional piece. It was, as a region, we really had a reporting rhythm, a financial performance rhythm, and that became for me the anchor point. So for many of the markets, the way to understand how we're working together came first around the way that we would our language of reporting financials, or reporting basically just the basis of the product. And that was something that helped because, like you say, I was used to being a specialist. I was used to knowing everything about the single market that I operated in prior to going into that role. So I found it really challenging to be on the phone as it was predominantly then, with a market, chatting to them about, so talked about how you do mortgages over there, and talked about how you do lending and why do you do it that way. So I had to I almost needed an excuse to talk to them. And I always would bring up an excuse and saying, so how's the monthly reporting, or how's that quarterly reporting going? And sort of talk around the pain. And it gave me a sense of, I was able to bond with them on a personal level because I understood the pain they were going through for reporting, which was relatively manual at that time. What that then enabled me to do, just interesting, because I'm curious. I'll ask a lot of questions naturally. I'm naturally sort of a nosy person, I suppose, or curious, I should say. And what that really lent itself to is I then start to understand more about how they went about thinking of mortgages. So how did product managers approach lending in Brunei versus Indonesia versus Philippines? How did they think about it? And that started to bring about certain, I'll say these cultural shifts or cultural sort of tags that came to mind when they would talk about, mortgages are really hard in this market. People feel really privileged to have them. So this is why we're doing this particular marketing activity, or this is why we price in that way. And you start to hear a difference between that in, I'll say, more emerging markets to those who were at much more mature economies, I would say.
Because the challenges are very different on a tactical level, aren't they? In Australia, the challenges might have been more related to, I guess, interest rates or sort of, macroeconomic things, whereas in the Philippines, there could literally be, and I think we had this when we were there would be a typhoon, and intense flooding, and people's houses would literally wash away with the mortgages attached to them. And so you're dealing with really different on the ground realities, but it sounds like you brought that together with shared KPIs initially, and kind of like having that shared understanding of the KPIs. What about the strategy side of it? How did you come up with a strategy that would kind of work across those markets without getting too tactical, I guess, because you can't get tactical because you just don't know the detail?
That's right. And look, it would be very common to say the approach really came through with something that would combine all of the markets together, so we could have a common strategy that worked in the region, which then was able to propel us towards a more global perspective as well. And it was understanding really two parts. One was the product maturity. How long had the product, the mortgage product, the lending product, actually been in market? And what that enables to do was start to think about the maturity of the access people had to the actual product itself, which then started thinking about, well, what is the emotion that customers have towards actually getting onto a mortgage? And I'll give a great example. So especially when I was shifting into the global role, it was being able to speak to markets such as a Brazil that would be coming out of, where access to property, access to actually having your own home was unheard of 20 years earlier. So you had generations of people who didn't own their own property. So mortgage was very much a cultural revolution thing for them. It was something that was starting to properly emerge, and it was a cultural shift. I take Russia, another example of a market where the word refinance didn't exist, because the market wasn't mature enough for people to say, yeah, I've lived in my home long enough, I now want to shift mortgage provider. It was almost a privilege for them to be able to own their home and actually start to have a place of shelter for their family, which is very different to an Australian, New Zealand, the US, a UK view, where it's not about access to property. It's actually price. It was competition. It was, well, I lead an investment property, I've got 3-4 property portfolios. So it really started, once I got an understanding, yeah, we know how you measure your market. I can get the fundamentals. How does it go up and down? It then started to come into its usage. And it really became clear very quickly that the bit that started to combine it was that customer emotion, that customer need for the property was in essence that the usage, the human element that started to really emerge as, well, this is the thing that combines us. What is the meaning of a home? Why own a home? Why do people want a home? And it was in answering that through HSBC, we're able to come up with what became this global strategy that we call What's in a Home, getting beyond the bricks of the whole property purchase and life cycle.
Yeah, it was something that I always thought HSBC, for the various flaws that it and all multinational banks, have had, I thought they always did very well. And it kind of started with the tagline everyone's heard of, the world's local bank, and kind of like being able to mix, the global strategy and actually make a global product portfolio work with extreme localization. And it sounds like what you're saying, there, and it's probably no surprise, but in order to do that, it's cultural, it's emotional, it's human, and then kind of bridging the gap between the tactics in the market and the strategy at the top is kind of like that feeling of culture is the thing that sort of connects, the tactics with the actual global strategy.
Yeah, absolutely right. And what we really started to see was suddenly a commonality in the marketing collateral, the material, the way that we started to speak about. It wasn't mortgages; it became about home, and that was something that transcended culture. It was, you can talk about the meaning of home in Mexico, you could talk about that in India, and people would resonate to it and think, oh, they're talking to people like me, and you were able then to see how. Although markets were quite different in terms of, I'll say, economic maturity, there was still often that base need, that base desire of, wow, that is what a home means to me. So you can have this image of people walking together and having, sharing time with family, with friends, or working or doing their different things. But what really resonated with me on that was, this was all based off a very simple product, a very simple lending product of, you want to buy a property, I'll give you a loan and you pay that back to me. And yet, across each market, there was this, albeit that they were combined with that same emotional feel. You'd have some in markets where rates were at 14% and some at 2%. And it's like, wow, if you took a product view, you would miss the whole rationale. You'd miss the strategic thing that pulls them together. And so it was really insightful. Definitely stuck with me.
Yeah. So before we move on to the next part of the journey, I just want to ask one more question about the global role, because I think a lot of the people that I speak to are in similar roles to you, in that, you could call it almost like a centralized strategy team or a centralized transformation team. And then you have a lot of teams underneath you, whether it's operations teams or countries. that are trying to kind of receive your strategy, but then mix it together with what they know to be the right thing to do on the ground.
Yes.
A very common bit of feedback. And I think something that, certainly the more empathetic people in your role often kind of worry about is partly the imposter syndrome, but also being accused of kind of being in an ivory tower and, throwing down ideas, but not really understanding, what that actually means in my team or in my market. How do you bridge, and how did you actually bridge that? And it sounded like you, even in your case, there were some cases where you weren't able to bridge that, which does not surprise me at all. I certainly didn't manage to bridge it for all of my markets. But how would you go about solving that kind of ivory tower, view that people have of centralized functions?
Yeah, absolutely right. Look, the phrase I used was, we need to translate the strategy into local language. When it was global, it really did mean translate it into another language so that everybody could understand it and could feel it. But it was much more the sense of, well, we can take this conceptual view, and then we need to actually break it down into what it means for the person in the branch, the person on the phone, the person in IT and technology, so that they could believe in it as well. And for me, the way we did that was through actual time. I realized, I wouldn't say quickly, I realized slowly that there weren't any shortcuts. So it meant that for thinking, I can just do this, have this one conversation, they'll get it. They didn't, and you'd see slippage. And it was, back then, travel. It was really getting into the market and actually understanding what they were going through, understanding how that business operated in that market, recognizing in some markets HSBC was number 1, in other markets it was number 12. And so that was a very different psyche then in the way that the people on the ground would be operating that strategy. And it was very important for me to understand that level of motivation, what motivated them. So that translation became not just a language thing, but spending a lot of time in understanding from their perspective what they were trying to do, and understanding in their words what it meant for them. And that to me was, definitely the biggest thing, was being able to stand next to them, see it from their perspective and say, okay, this is how it means, this is how we need to be operating, this is what we should be doing.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll add to that. I think from a personal perspective and knowing you personally, I think your empathetic nature and just your kind of, general approachability made a massive difference in that as well. Like watching the way that people would respond to you versus some of our colleagues it was very different. And I think if they'd have got vibes of, pseudo-intellectual, MBA educated kind of stuff from you, they would have been turned off pretty quickly. And I think that works for you very well. Yeah, great. And look, I think it was a personable approach. I definitely wanted each of those markets to feel I had the time for them. And, today we talk a lot about being present and authenticity. Like I say, I was just really curious to think, I think this is a great idea. I want them to believe it too. To do that, I better understand where they're coming from. I need to understand what's making them tick. Yeah, I remember you were, I think with this something we both did quite well, we were both very interested in a genuine way about what was happening, whether it was a natural disaster or, something about the economy, having that curiosity about the local markets, the local teams, and then being able to kind of use that as the bridge to the global strategy was quite effective.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think it was. I think that it's all the different cultures. It is just really fascinating.
It was a cool role. I personally found it very challenging mostly for that imposter syndrome reason, but it was definitely a cool role, and I don't regret doing it at all.
Yeah, no, good. I think you were very good at the role. And like I say, was the imposter piece. What I would say is, I always had to have, and it's probably a football thing, but I always had to have a belief that I was good at something. And so when I'd be going into the room in some of these markets, it was very much a case of thinking, well, I know I'm really good at the product basic. I know I can do that piece. So if it gets to that, cool. But there's things that surround it, that's the bit that we need to understand. And that put them in control. And the good thing about when someone feels in control is they're able to relax, they're able to open up. And what that meant is we could then come back into, so they're not in control. They're now sharing with me their insights, their beliefs. That's making the product a bit stronger. I can now relay that product back into that cultural context. And it was that sort of game that was really, I think, as I break it down now, that was sort of how I was able to not feel completely out of my depth in some of these markets.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to kind of move it forward to the next part of your journey, and this is, I'm going to kind of give a summary, so correct me if any of this is inaccurate, but you moved to Australia in the financial services market, and the first role you took, I think, was intended to be around helping AMP be more innovative and kind of create new products. But the reality was, it just so happened that when you moved to Australia, it coincided with, I think, a very challenging time for the industry, particularly parts of the industry that were focused on superannuation, so pensions, insurance products. There was a Royal Commission happening, which is essentially a very, very big national inquiry, when it only really happens when things have gone really, really, really badly. And there were some pretty awful things happening across the industry in terms of, insurance products, vastly overpriced insurance products being sold to people who didn't need them and couldn't afford them. There were kind of interest rates being charged to people who were no longer alive, fees being charged to people that were dead. Quite a few other things as well were happening across the industry. I think I don't think there was any financial institute in Australia that was untouched by some degree of that inquiry. And you ended up trying to help salvage, I suppose, AMP from that situation. It sounds to me like what was happening there was almost the opposite of what had worked well at HSBC in terms of, that focus on culture, that focus on the humans, that focus on the people behind the products that were being sold had just completely gone. And it had almost gone so KPI driven that people had forgotten the why of what they were doing.
Yeah, look, I think there's a good summary, and there's a lot of truth in what you were saying there. For me, I quite rightly so, I decided a decision to leave HSBC. I joined AMP. Like you said, the idea is to be head of innovation and change in their bank, very small bank, but well positioned, without branches, to really be a digital native bank. And it was right, boom, off we go. Let's bring in some of this global might and let's make it happen. A few months in, the Royal Commission into superannuation financial services really kicked off, and AMP, being, I'll say, the first letter of the alphabet, really found itself in the headlights in terms of the investigation of what was predominantly cultures past, but cultures that had been hard-coded into systems, hard-coded into, and not just AMP, but for all fin services, hard-coded into systems, hard-coded into then the way things were reported, which made it difficult for people to challenge it and question it, because it was, oh, well, is this how we've always done it? Is that a good thing? Oh, maybe it is. Okay, all right, and we keep going. So the cultures in Australian banking, in Australian financial services, to me, were simply a decade behind the rest of the world. I think the global financial crisis had forced, just through the nature of the crisis, the size of that, the GFC, the global financial crisis, just the size of that had forced a lot of other financial services institutions around the world to really look at themselves, pull their socks up, and move into a world of much more transparent and fair pricing and banking in that sense. Australia had a very small dip as part of the GFC in relative terms, and so that internal investigation never really took place. You didn't see people, literally literally sleeping in their car because they weren't in their home, so having to count every cent, take place in Australia. So as I arrived in Australia, there were certain practices that I just wasn't used to seeing, because I'll say I grew up a good 10 years at HSBC, so I just wasn't used to seeing some of these practices. So the Royal Commission, I'll say, started to peel back or lift the lid on some of those things. Yeah. AMP was certainly caught in the headlights, and I found myself moved into a head of group strategy role, or joining the group strategy team, which was really front and center with the new CEO to figure out how does AMP navigate its way out of this? What do we want to be? And then what are the strategies to actually get us out of this current situation?
Yeah, and I'd be keen to hear about those strategies in a minute. I'll maybe just give my perspective of it, because I had a different experience of the same situation where I was, and so it was less around superannuation, more around credit card, insurance, and things like that. It was kind of all caught up in the same sort of thing. And I think when I look back on it now, what I realize is that I came into an environment where I think the banks in Australia actually didn't have a strategy. What they had is a set of KPIs, and those KPIs would get positioned as the strategy. So it was like, hey, our strategy is to increase our gross margin by 20%, or our strategy is to increase revenue by 20%. And that was pretty much it. There was no why, there was no outcome, there was not really anything innovative. And so that focus on KPIs, and only KPIs, rather than outcomes, rather than even the tactics, meant that you just got this kind of like razor focus on margins, which just drove people into these, I'm going to say, shadier and shadier practices where they did have an impact on the KPIs, but you absolutely lost sight of why you were doing any of it. And you would walk away proud if you just managed to hit the KPI, regardless of the tactics you used to get there, and regardless of whether you'd actually delivered anything meaningful in terms of, repositioning the bank. That was what I think I came into, and I think, that's what caused it. Tell me about some of the tactics that you tried to employ to kind of move, in your case, AMP, away from that.
Yeah, well, I think you're spot on in terms of your perspective there. I think it's a good perspective to bring in. So one of the things that we looked at for AMP was, as you're saying, it was to start to think about purpose. What is the purpose of the organization? And I actually learned a lot about AMP. In my research and going into the organization, I probably didn't go as far back as the origins of the company, but what we started to unearth, and through simply asking customers, was the noble nature of how AMP began. And one of those things where it was, well, why has this happened? I'm there thinking, and why was there such an emotional reaction towards AMP where I was, which I got a sense was different than to the other market, to the other institutions, which, to your point, were more, well, that was financially driven. That's what drove that decision. That's not a good thing. Let's talk about it. Where it was much more emotive, I would say, on AMP. And trying to unpick that took you down a point where you start to think, oh, right, it was there because people thought they cared about them, that AMP was there, that it traveled them around the world, it gave them insurance, they always felt safe. And what they got a sense of was being let down. And that was very different to, so it's not financial performance, it isn't this, they actually just feel let down. We were the sleepy uncle on the rocking chair that you could go and talk to, and it was safe. And then it was quite a different story. So really what started to emerge was a way, or a key strategy to get out of this. One of the ways to come out of it was certainly by having a noble purpose. And that noble purpose is something that really resonated with me. And I think it was quite important as a strategist. You have to believe in what you're talking about. And for me, it was recognizing where the Australian citizen was going, and recognizing that they still needed someone to be there for them through, I'll use superannuation as an easy example, is, as superannuation increases, and that's something that is, it's a fantastic vehicle for Australians. But what it does mean is they will have more money, and with more money comes more wealth, which means suddenly you have to think about, well, how do you manage that wealth? What do you do with it? So the strategies really came about understanding that Australians were going into a problem about wealth management, about they need appropriate advice and guidance in order to help them through that future. So forget what you think about AMP or any provider. That to me was a noble issue, was, geez, Australians are going to get wealthier because we have this fantastic superannuation structure, which means more and more people are going to need some sort of advice on how to best manage that money in order to help them live the future, live the life they want to live. And then it's a case of, right, well, now that's it. There's a very clear problem that's out there that people believe in. Who's going to solve that? Who's got the right to actually go in there and help the Australian citizen how to manage that. And so it was through coming up with that noble purpose. It was then a case of, right, well, how do you then structure this organization to be the one to go ahead and meet that particular purpose, and what are the strategies that we could employ? And a lot of it came through, I'll say remediating, but saying sorry to people who had felt let down. How do you go about doing things? How do you go about doing that? There's a big program about resetting that particular emotional attachment to those who felt let down, whilst also looking at, well, what is the business model? Business model was structured much more on a financially driven outcome perspective. And it was then, well, you need to change that. You need to take certain departments out and bring different functions together so that they can now actually have a view of customer. So you guys are here to try and solve that.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's probably no surprise, but it's almost a similar strategy to what you talked about in the markets at HSBC. It's going past the product and going into the use of the product. What are people doing with the value that comes from the product, and then almost rebuild the product to match that value, rather than getting fixated on either the product itself, which the customer actually doesn't give a crap about, right? All they care about is what they can do with it. And then kind of like trying to connect from a positioning and a brand and a marketing perspective with that human side of what you're doing.
Absolutely right. And it was moving past the product, the multiple products, the regulatory construct. Is it wrapped, not wrapped, inside? People didn't understand. There were so many different terms that would be thrown about at the start of these meetings. And that got really whittled down to saying, well, what are the customer's goals?
Yeah.
Well, how do they want to live?
Yeah.
What are the key things that are going to come up in their life? Right. Well, how do they get money ready for that particular event? And once you have that view, suddenly you can then say, right, well, now I can employ several consumer strategies to meet that. And here are the products that might help them achieve those types of outcomes.
Yeah.
So it really helped shape the way, I'll say, the whole organization, which was quite fragmented. Well, which when you looked at it was fragmented because the KPIs were separate. It brought them together and said, okay, what are now the common goals? What does a new value chain look like for the organization? And who are the consumers that we really want to go out and reach? Can we simplify this much more?
Yeah.
And those were some of the key elements that really came out, whilst also looking at the internal culture, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it sort of gives you an indication as to where what was successful and where's the organization now, what should be focused on more than others. But yeah, so there were many different things that we had to employ to try and achieve that bold vision.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're doing a similar thing with our own product as well, whereby we'll have quarterly review sessions with our larger customers, and in the past we talk about how is your use of the product going, and we talk about product. And now we actually don't do that anymore. What we talk about is, for example, if we're working with an organization that's working on, rolling out a global vaccine for COVID-19, as an example, we'll start off that meeting and say, how is the global rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine going? And then we'll kind of talk about how Cascade as a product is helping them with that. But we talk about their outcomes, not our product.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that is so powerful, and in financial services, certainly in Australia, so alien to the way that things are. It has generally been, oh, you've got an investment portfolio, it went up 2%, it's gone down 5% this month, let me give you a monthly, weekly, daily snapshot on, boom, this is how your shares are doing, that's what's going on. Whereas when you think most of those consumers in Australia from wealth financial services, it's it's not the product, it's, am I saving for that goal? How far am I along that goal? And I've had a blip. Why? Because again, simple thing, because we're having a baby. Right. Well, in which case, should we pause something? Should we change something? Reduce costs a bit for a period? Wow, that would be great. I'd much rather you did that rather than me having to refinance to somebody else. That's fantastic. And so getting past that product and understanding the goals of because I think that's, it's absolutely, it's definitely the right thing, certainly from my belief. And that brings with it a an engagement, it brings with it then, sort of importantly, just begins a trust. It's like, oh, they're here to help me. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, look, what I would say is what I did love about that bold vision was there wasn't an answer. You didn't create this vision with a known answer. It cried for innovation. It cried for market innovation, and it was very much a call out at that time and for Australia financial services need to come together to solve this problem. And I, again, forgetting the company, forgetting even my job, I was like, oh, that's really cool. I'm going to try and solve that. How can, can I solve at AMP? Can I need to be somewhere else to solve that? But solving that to me is certainly something that, again, sits with me right now and really starts propelling me to think about, well, what should I be doing next?
Yeah, definitely getting beyond, the tactics into the real outcome, not just for you, but for the customer, and dare I say it, for the world, which I know sounds a bit cheesy and cliche. Everyone talks about that, but it is the reality when you're working in these giant industries.
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I guess that brings us kind of up to date, really, in terms of where you are at the moment. So you made the decision, and I think you alluded to this a moment ago. How can you best help not just an organization, but actually a whole industry repurpose itself around purpose, I guess. And that kind of, I'm guessing, was a big driver, for you to move onto almost, I'm going to say the other side of the fence, which probably, I guess people don't like it called that, but we used to call it that when I was in the industry, into the kind of more government regulatory side of things. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think once we set and, I think I'd done what I could do, delivered what I could do at AMP, it was very much a view of, this is a real problem, and I felt a real desire to go and help, solve this noble purpose. So I left AMP and moved to New South Wales State Government, where I'm now working in Treasury, again in strategy for banking, payment, financial services. And here there are now 10 million citizens and a few million businesses, small businesses and corporates, who I'm now trying to support from the inside. I'll say, not the other side, but from the inside. And so it's fascinating because now it's very much about citizen and small business outcomes. It isn't that there's no talk of profit. It's a one-sided P&L, in many respects, and it is about looking at how do we change? How do I, in my team, change the way that the government consumes or uses its banking and financial services products for to improve the outcomes for citizens and small businesses, and that to me is now a really powerful mandate to go and work across, and something that's really got me thinking about, well, how do I achieve that vision of helping people manage money, make payments, receive payments from government as part of their life.
It's a noble cause, and I imagine it must be quite difficult, partly because of people like me who kind of see it as an us and them thing. Not that I do see that anymore, but I remember at times I would sort of see it like that when it came to governments. How do you, I guess, try to get through that us and them mentality between, government and business, or regulation versus, profit for the organization? How do you bridge that?
It's been absolutely brilliant, because I think certainly the state government is going through a phase of recognizing that dialogue can improve. And what it's doing is moving from what has been probably much more motherhood statements, I would say, previously, and through our current sort of Treasurer Secretary, it's moving towards very much outcome, very much citizen-based metrics, and that's something that the state premier, she's really trying to drive, is what we should be measuring is how it impacts customers. So our citizens and businesses. A simple example being, for many people who have got school-age children in the public system, you want to make a payment, you're scrabbling around looking for coins or looking for checks to make these payments, and it's a case of, well, how do you make that bit easier? What am I doing to make it easier for people to make payments for their kids to go on an excursion, to go see the library? And it's like, oh, actually, that's really nice. That's a really good thing and I know that I can make that difference. And most people that I'm going to walk past, most adults, I'm like, I made that easier when they use their face, thumb ID, whatever, to go and boom, make a payment instantly. And they think, oh, that was so much easier. I'm like, oh, I can help to change some of that. So it's been very much a case of looking at what the outcome is for the citizen, what the outcome is for the business, small businesses especially, and putting metrics in place to help drive the behavior of government to have that type of dialogue. That's been very different.
Yeah. And I think, I guess it makes me think of the current situation that a lot of the world finds itself in, either in lockdown or at the end of lockdown and coming out of it, depending on where you are in the world. And I feel like there's something about that word purpose, which I think is overused, and you've got this whole purposeful industry that is probably not quite where that should be. But, at the core of it, I think it's very real at the moment, in that I notice a lot of people, they're no longer motivated by just hitting KPIs. They're no longer motivated by even just like earning, 10% more or hitting a bonus. I think when you're working at home a lot, that sense of purpose in a more meaningful way becomes just so much more important, because you don't have any of the stage of the office environment. And so you go, what am I actually doing? Like, I'm sitting here, my kids are there, maybe my wife is over there or whatever. And sometimes they even hear you talking, actually. I find that is interesting. When my partner overhears me talking, I start to think, am I just talking crap here? Like, am I actually making a difference to anything? And it makes you more conscious of it. Is that something you found in kind of, the current environment, that moving to that sense of vision, that sense of purpose, knowing the why of what you do rather than just going through the motions has become more important in the last year or two?
Yes, it has. And, for me, the thing is, when you think the Truman Show, you think when you wake up, you leave your house and you see everybody else going to get on the bus or going to get in the metro, getting in their cars, all driving towards the city, getting out, getting a coffee, getting into the office, sitting down, and everyone else is doing it. And it's like, well, okay, well, that's what I should be doing. Right, boom, off you go. And it becomes natural. It becomes, subconscious. You just, boom, this is what I'm doing. All of that stopped. Like you say, you find yourself at home, you're waking up and you're like, oh, well, I don't have anybody to copy. No one else is outside. No one else is doing this. I'm now logging in. Why am I doing this? You have that time to reflect, because you no longer have a peer pressure. You're no longer just following a crowd to do it. And so for me, it's opened up to me the way of thinking, well, given what that purpose, that's what I might believe in, then what am I doing? Am I actually delivering am I making that right? Am I making the change that I want to make on the world? Am I leaving that right footprint? So I've got 3 boys. Like you say, they overhear me talking. Now, I've been pretty much since the COVID period, I've been at the state government. So when they hear, non-secret things, and they're like, oh, wow, so are you doing that for schools? Are you doing that for hospitals? When I go to a hospital, it's going to look like this now. Mm. And it feels like, oh, right, that is that's good. It actually feels like I'm doing something that is purposeful. And, the question I now ask myself is, well, is it going far enough? Am I as close to the citizens or close to individuals as I want to be? And that's the piece that I suppose I'm looking at now, and I'm challenging them, saying, well, actually, there's probably an even more impactful way to deliver that change. And finding that is now, I guess, the next piece, that next strategy. Yeah,
cool. Well, and that kind of leads me, I guess, to my final question. And you can answer this in any way that you like, but what's next for you? Where do you want to kind of, turn your focus to, and what are you most excited about in the next 18 months?
Wonderful question. I'm excited about everything. No, I guess
playing football again.
Yes, playing football. Actually, that I am looking forward to. Hopefully, within the next 12 months, I will definitely be on a football field with, I guess, 21 other men playing football. That will definitely be something to look forward to. I think professionally, or in fact, I won't say professionally, I'll just say, outside of playing football and the family, what else do I look to do? I think that I'm really looking to keep helping at a community level, at a societal level. And one of the bits that I'm really recognizing now as I'm speaking to friends and colleagues is that their desire to try and do something different. And what I really want to be doing next is thinking, well, how can I help them to shift their pattern and shift their daily life into something where they feel they found purpose. And so for many, that might be shifting a career or changing their job. I think for others, it might be just what they do in their day. You know, I'm very much of a belief that if you want to change something, you have to look at what's next in your diary. So who are you speaking to next? And if the people that you're speaking to next are not putting you on a path that you want to be, where you can find that purpose, you can find that, I guess, that sense of achievement, then you need to change the diary. You need to change those people. So I'm now what those next interactions are going to be. So I'm really excited now about starting this new venture where I'm going to help put people on that path and try and do that at a level that impacts more than one person at a time, but can do it a bit more at scale.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It correlates a lot with something that we're, I think, feeling and also seeing in what we do, which is we're kind of like calling it almost like the great resignation. And I think it's kind of like something that I feel like it's coming partly because of, you know, the burnout that I think a lot of people have right now. Yeah. I think people are working longer hours and it's less compartmentalized. And I think at first people love that, right? But then the longer you go, the more you realize that your work-life balance has perhaps changed in a way that you didn't intend it to. And I think people are struggling with that. And I think, you know, what you're going to see is a lot of people asking themselves that exact question of like, why am I doing this? There's a lot of existential stuff around right now, you know, just the environment, the news, everything. And I think organizations that don't realize that and realize that they need to, you know, they can't just use KPIs, whether it's, you know, the company's KPIs or the individual KPIs or even the individual salary to motivate them anymore. People are demanding a lot more than that. And I think a lot of people are going to, if the organization does not do a good job of embracing tools, then I would say that. Obviously, I've got a vested interest in that, in investing in tools, investing in processes and cultural change to bring that purpose to what people do. Those people are gonna leave, and you know, some will leave anyway. They may change careers, and it sounds like you're kind of, you know, feeling that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes down to that trust as well. And I think for many people, what they're looking for in an organization is one that trusts them to do the right thing whilst helping them to achieve their purpose in life. And those things coming together, I think, like you're saying, we're seeing this at least intent of a resignation of this. I want to change. And what I really recognize is people want to do that, have time to think. Who do they reach out to? How do they get to that sense of confidence on this is where I want to go? And it's making, you know, I really want to help people to do that. And it doesn't need to be me, but they need to go to the right people because it's that view that I think that through this COVID period, we've got a great opportunity to somewhat reset the way that we think about our working life. And yes, there probably is going to be a lot more blurring that comes through. So it's going to be a race for organizations to recognize that and be able to change their practices to support it. And for those who I think have this, who have taken the time to have a purpose, who have taken the time to think about, well, why do we as an organization exist? They can be a lot more flexible because they can say, oh, well, we've said we wanted to help people do this. So, well, that means this is what our company now looks like. Whereas for those who don't have that sense of purpose, then they're going to struggle. They need to act now to try and get that sense of purpose quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we're seeing that too. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed the chat. I mean that very genuinely. We talk not as often as we should, but I've enjoyed this one a lot. And yeah, I really want to thank you for coming on the Strategy Factory, and hopefully it's been fun for you too.
It's been great fun. Thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, it was good to chat. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. Bye.